Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting in our series of thinning webinars for the Champlain Valley. I'm Mike Bastow, tree fruit specialist with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. Before we begin, I'd like to first make a shout out to our commercial sponsor, Owesco in Conway, Massachusetts, with a big thank you for their financial support for our series. The people at Owesco would like to thank everyone for this opportunity and remind you that they're here for you with parts, service, and sales support through these stressful times. Owesco staff may be reached at 413-369-4335, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Our focus today will be on thinning strategies for 15 millimeter and beyond, and we're joined today by Dr. Terence Robinson of Cornell University Agritech. This meeting also provides us all the opportunity to discuss openly and ask any questions to Terence about our thinning applications that we made so far. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, John.
How you doing? I'm out of place here, but I just want to say that I was curious to see if Terence will have any comments about Hudson Valley, because everything's coming, not everything, but a lot's coming off here in Massachusetts. I mean, I'm seeing the crop go downhill rapidly. Just my initial impression.
Sure. Yeah, I've been hearing a decent amount of that down in the valley too. It sounds like they had quite a bit of natural thinning from all the heat that they had. And I think out in the Lake Ontario region, they've been seeing some amount of that as well.
In retrospect, I'd have been real curious to see what would have happened if we hadn't applied any thinners.
Right, yeah.
That's all. I just wanted to tell that. I'd be careful up there. Maybe you guys are in better shape than we are.
Sure.
I know it's a better place to grow apples anyways. All right.
Hey, Mike.
Yep.
Good afternoon, Will Gunnison.
Hey, Will, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Just a little bit of what we're seeing here in our farm. Honeycrisp really thinned quite aggressively this year. We put a petal fall spray on, and then a very, very light application. I was a little hesitant at the 10 and 12 millimeter range.
Mm-hmm.
And seems like they're coming off like crazy, whereas the Macintosh, which are right beside them, are struggling to get apples off, and we still have some pretty strong clusters there. Just seems like the thinning has been very variable based on the variety and by block. And it's, I mean, you can be at one end of the block and you have a totally different condition from what you have to the other end of the block. Are you experiencing or seeing or hearing of that with other growers, or are we all alone in the boat?
No, I think we're seeing similarly. Gary actually mentioned that earlier, where he had really good thinning on his Honeycrisp, and the Macs are holding on a little bit stronger. Certainly in other spots in Peru, we've been seeing similarly as well. I think the Honeycrisp are, in general, thinning down a bit more easily than the Macs certainly are this season.
Generally, when we apply our thinner, our trees will flag, and they flag for a few days, and then they kind of start coming around.
Mm-hmm.
But they just seem to be flagging a lot longer than normal. Are other people experiencing the increased amount of time of flagging?
Looking around, I haven't noticed it sticking around for all that long, but I'm not sure what everyone's seeing on their sites.
This is Jesse. I agree, Will. It's been extremely variable. I think there are even just within a tree or a couple trees, like several different conditions of cluster health or cluster viability or whatever, and it's all over the place.
Sure presents a challenge as to what to go back at them at this 15 millimeter range. We still have obviously a strong king, and then in some cases we've got clusters of 4, 5, and even 6, and the side laterals are a little bit smaller in diameter, but
They're 11 to 12.
you know, then we've put two applications of 7.5 parts of NAA on and a pint of 7, and I can't believe they're not moving. I really thought that would do the trick, and we had perfect. You know, we fell right in that sweet spot of that 200 to 250 range, and I just really thought we'd see more activity than what we're seeing.
Right. Yeah. I think this year, part of it, what might be playing into it a little bit is just the fact that we had such a quick bloom. I don't think we're seeing as much separation between the kings and the laterals this season, where, we might normally have a little bit longer. We might get a little bit more of a size differentiation there. So that might be in some cases. And then certainly within the same tree, just the variability from cluster to cluster as well. Low in the tree, I'm seeing kings that are, on some varieties, 15, 16, whereas other clusters on the tree that the kings might still be down 8 to 10. So, just a really challenging crop this season so far for thinning.
Do you think any of it is attributed to the fact that we have had no rain to redistribute the pint of 7?
Yeah, I think that could certainly be playing a role in it. Certainly, whenever we're under a degree of water stress, I think that can be playing into some of what we're seeing. I think the temperatures have been challenging too, going from, periods of high 80s, 90 degrees, and then going right back down to temperatures that are back down to the 60s, where we might not even peak 70 on some days for thinner activity. So I think it depends a lot on when the different applications went out too. So when you got them out on those really hot days, we're seeing some of that more advanced thinning, whereas those other applications where we might have made those on those days where we didn't get much above, the low 70s, we're probably struggling there. So, there's certainly just a lot of factors this season.
I guess one final question I have is, I just heard, I believe it was John talking, Massachusetts seems to be thinning down quite well. The Hudson Valley is thinning heavier than what they had really wanted. Ohio and Pennsylvania experienced some damage. I haven't heard anything on Michigan and Washington. Are we better off carrying a little heavier load this year because so many regions are off?
I think we certainly could be. I would also just wonder, certainly the cold damage that we had been seeing across the state is certainly factoring in there. Even if we haven't had that much frost damage ourselves, I think there might still be some residual from those more marginal events where, that could certainly, if it doesn't kill the flower outright, could lead to easier thinning as well. So, I wonder if that might be playing into it as well. All right, I see Terence is on with us now.
Yeah,
Terence, we've been just discussing as a group what we've been seeing out in the orchard so far this week. I would say the consensus is it's very variable this season. Some blocks are thinning down easier than others. Sounds like Honeycrisp are thinning down a bit easier than Max. I did a bit of scouting around this morning. I've been seeing Max that are still have easily 2 to 3 fruit per cluster. I think the Cortlands are still set pretty heavily up. Some of the Gala blocks I've been looking at similarly doubles and triples still. Depending on the site, Honeycrisp might be down to singles. So I think we had a decent amount of thinning on the Honeycrisp blocks. New York 1, depending on the block, could still have a decent amount of fruit on them. Others have thinned down pretty well. So certainly, depending on the orchard and the block, I'd say, what's left is variable right now, depending on those varieties. But in general, yeah, it seems like Honeycrisp has thinned down a bit easier this season than some of the others.
Well, let me make just a couple of comments. I quickly ran the carbohydrate model for Peru, and just to look at where you are in degree days, and you're pretty much past the prime thinning window. But there's still a window of late thinning if needed. But 10, 12 millimeter, 13 millimeter sprays that went on in the last 3 to 4 days, we really can't see the effects of those yet. And so it's very difficult to determine whether or not you need any more thinning at this time. But I did want to mention that it looks to me like there's a window coming up with reasonable temperatures that's in 3 to 4 days if needed. So temperatures after the 11th, they dropped into the 70s, 60s, 70s, pretty much bright sunshine. Those are really good days for thinning, but they may not be needed. The only way to really know whether or not you achieved the thinning that you were after with the sprays that went on in the last few days is to measure fruits. And anybody that sent me measurements, they've looked good, and I've sent back responses to Mike and to the others that have sent me those information. And it looked to me like that, as Mike said, Honeycrisp would thin down reasonably well. The only problem is when you start with way too many spurs. So in one particular case, you know, the target was around 100, but they had like almost 400 flowering spurs, 380 per tree. So even if you thin down to singles, you still ended up with 380 fruits. And then it's hard to thin down below that. So that just stresses the importance of not leaving too many flowering spurs in an on year. Now, if you thin to singles and you had pruned to bud load of about 1.8, you still have a few too many fruits, but that can be dealt with hand thinning. Other blocks of Honeycrisp that I've seen the data for indicate they're thinning down close to the target. That's happened in a lot of different places around the state. And so I would guess that we're probably going to thin that down fairly well, except for blocks that had way too many flowering spurs. They probably will be biennial again because you just can't overcome it when you start with way too many flowering spurs based upon your target number. It's been surprising to me, the data that I've seen, that Max still haven't thinned down well enough, but I think sprays yesterday or the day before or the day before that will probably do an excellent job with Max, and we won't need to worry anymore. Snapdragon also looked like it had thinned down well, and sprays that would have gone on in the last few days, I think, have done probably the job there. For Gala, not too many people grow Gala in the Champlain Valley, but for those that do, it has been difficult to thin this year, to get it down to the target number in a number of places around the state. And so that's one that you might look at with measurements of fruit to determine whether you still need to apply another spray late this week or early next week. I appreciate Mike doing several trials where he's measured fruits, and then others of individual growers have measured fruits. It's given us a good feel for what's going on there. But I think that by and large, we're probably done thinning. Also, I wanted to add that the heat that we're going to experience in the next couple of days will hasten the response of the thinners that went on in the last few days. And so you should be able to see that response late in the week, early next week. But certainly you can see it clearly with measurements of fruit 3 days and 5 days or 8 days after the application went on. Now, one last comment about measurement fruits. If you're measuring fruits and you've already measured 1 or 2 times, if you just wait 5 days after the last application and measure one more time without a second measurement after that spray, it still gives you a fairly good idea of what's happening. And that's quick enough that you can respond if you're not getting the thinning you need. But I think we're probably pretty well set and won't need much more thinning, especially for those of you that sprayed in the last few days. So let me listen a little more and try to answer questions and see what you'd like to say, discuss.
All right, great. Thank you, Terrence. So with that, I think the real advantage of this meeting today is, the ability to really ask specific questions about what you're seeing in your blocks. So why don't we go ahead and open it up? Feel free to ask questions, unmute yourself directly.
Hi, Terrence. This is Jesse. I was so I feel like what I'm seeing a lot of on my farm right now are some sort of a weird phenomenon with some differentiation amongst just clusters on the tree. We've got some very, I guess what I'd categorize as a strong cluster, and the strong cluster has, a 14 to 16 millimeter king, and it has some 8 to 12 millimeter laterals and looks fairly normal. But then on the same tree, I've got a lot of clusters where my king is 8 to 12 millimeters. And one aspect of my question is I'm not quite sure how to handle that, because on a cluster like that, there seems to be a lot less differentiation. I don't know if I'm going to lose them all, including the king, or if I need to thin again there. And more broadly, I was hoping you might speak a little bit on the phenomenon of June drop, and maybe what we can expect to see, or any indications that we can use from the thinning season to inform what might naturally be falling off the tree after we've supposedly set our crop.
Okay. Well, let me tackle those two kind of different questions. The first is different sizes of kings on the same tree. Now, my first question really is, are you sure that the smaller ones have a true king? You can tell that clearly right at bloom, but 20 days after bloom, it's kind of hard to tell if the king was missing. And so if the king was missing for whatever reason, then all the laterals are about the same size. And that's typically what I see. I don't usually see the situation you've described where you've got small kings and big kings. What I see is that the kings were lost, and now you can't really tell which was the king, and they're all the laterals are sort of similar in size. But that may not be the case with you, Jesse. I'm just asking. But regardless, if you have that situation where most of the fruits you want to keep are now 15, 16 millimeters, and you have a bunch of others at 9 and 10, they will thin off easy. Now, if you need those smaller fruits to have a full complement of a crop, then you should take sort of a cautious approach and thin with lower doses. In most cases, where we've pruned to a level where we have insurance buds, we don't need those. And those often just give a smaller fruit size, and it's great to be able to thin them off. So if you haven't put on that sort of 12 millimeter spray yet, those would be the prime ones you'd be taking off with that spray. You won't touch the 15, 16 millimeter ones, but you'll touch those that are smaller. And that has to be a decision you make based on whether you need some of those or you don't need them. Now, any other part of that one before I go on to June drop? Let me comment then on June drop. June drop is a phenomenon that has influenced largely by two factors. One is an excessive crop load going into June, and then some carbohydrate deficit in June. So the tree has the capability to carry many more fruits than it can ultimately carry for a period of time. But then heat and dark, cloudy weather will cause the tree to shed those excess fruits. Since we've begun this more sequential applications of thinners and have thinned the crop down earlier, and the tree isn't carrying an excessive natural crop load, we see much less evidence of June drop. However, if June presents us with severe carbohydrate deficits, it will thin, even after we're done thinning. And that really is a situation where you get warm, hot weather, but dark, cloudy, muggy weather. Now, the data that I'm looking at right now on the Peru website indicates it's going to be fairly bright sunshine. We'll have some up to about 80 degrees and high 70s, but with bright sunshine. The tree's not likely to experience great carbohydrate deficit, and so it probably won't have a huge June drop where we have thinned properly. Now, I will hasten to add that over the years that we've been measuring fruitlets, and we continue measuring ours at Geneva past the thinning stage. And if you just keep measuring every week, the predicted number of fruits generally drops. It drops only about 15 to 20%. So if you have exactly the number of fruits that you wanted, you might end up losing another 15% over time, and they'll be slightly below your target. But if you are close to your target with just a few extra fruits, that often results in essentially being right on the target after a couple more weeks or by the end of June. A lot depends on the weather, and this is the thing that we haven't appreciated so much in the past. Junes without great carbohydrate deficit, we don't have very much June drop, and we end up 1st of July saying, where did all this fruit come from? And just get busy hand thinning, and we're kicking ourselves for not being more aggressive. But in other years where we do get significant carbohydrate deficits in June after the last thinning spray, we can still get more drop caused by these deficits, and then sometimes we end up just looking really good and think, wow. The reason we've been able to figure that out is we leave unthinned trees, and we sometimes measure a certain number of fruits on unthinned trees, and then they start going to lower numbers as we go through June. And other years they don't. So I don't know if that's enough of an explanation, maybe much more than you wanted about June drop.
No, that's very much appreciated, and I'm going to be keeping a close eye on the temperature and the weather. Can you kind of just keep using the carb model and
Absolutely. Just
yeah.
keep using that model. And
Yeah.
if you start seeing any serious daily deficits of say minus 60, minus 80, minus 100, you're going to get June drop.
Yeah. Well, it's something I'm thinking about in relation to some of those clusters. I'll go back out. I mean, I was kind of calling them small kings because I didn't notice any scarring or any missing, dot at the basal part of the cluster.
Yeah.
Where you'd kind of see like the wound of a flower that got sheared off. But yeah, we're basically 1 or 2, and in just a couple of cases 3 days out from our 10 to 12 spray. So we've had weather in the touching into the mid 70s, but a lot of cooler weather, and I haven't been able to see too much from that yet. But I'm expecting. We went out there pretty aggressively, especially on the max and stuff. So I'm expecting to see something in the next few days, because we were being advised, day to day to increase our rates by 30%, and we went ahead and followed that. So
I think you'll get great response, and I think you'll be able to see that response by measuring fruits 5 days after the last application. Just one measurement. It'll give you an early indication of how much you're getting out of that.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Terence. Good afternoon. This is Will Gunnison. How are you today?
Good.
We applied our second application, 10 to 12 millimeter, Friday. Came in with another 7.5 parts NA and a pint of 7 on our Macintosh. And we have a very similar situation that Jesse has, where we have kings that are 15 plus millimeters and the laterals are down around 10 to 12 millimeters at this time. Mm-hmm. And we also have the clusters where the king is missing 5 strong laterals of, right around that 10 to 12 millimeter range. Mm-hmm. So we measured fruit yesterday, which was Monday, and we're going to measure it again tomorrow. So my question to you is, how long would you delay applying a final application? And if we do not see a significant size differential moving forward on what would you apply on Macintosh to come back in and bust those things up a little bit?
Well, the best way to be able to react quickly is to do this measurements of fruit, but I don't think you've been measuring fruits. So that just a single measurement wouldn't tell us anything. You have to have two measurements, a pair. They have to be at least 3 days apart. You could measure some now and in 3 days. But for example, in Jesse's case, where he's had previous measurements, a single measurement 5 days after spraying lets him know whether he needs to spray again. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait till you see visible signs that the thinner did or didn't work, and that generally takes 8 to 10 days. Now, if it's warm, it'll be 8 days. If it's cool, it'll be 10 days, and then I think you're going to be out of the window.
So we did measure 3 days after application. And then we're going to measure again tomorrow, which will be that 5 day after application.
Well, then immediately, if you'll be able to see it, I'll look at the data if you want me to. Mike can look at it for you, but we'll be able to tell tomorrow what's happening, and then you can react. But if you aren't getting much thinning, your second question is, what do I do?
Correct.
So for Max, NAA basically doesn't work after about 15 to 16 millimeters. The trees become very tolerant to it. That's why we can spray NAA return bloom sprays on Honeycrisp and not get any thinning. You'd get a little bit at 16, 17 millimeters, but it's not very much. But what has worked is switching to Maxell and 7 and oil when the fruits are 18, 19 millimeters. And we do get some thinning. It's not aggressive, but we get some thinning that helps get that down. So if after the measurements tomorrow, we looked at that data and it just looked like nothing was working for you, you could probably come back in, or you could come back in with Maxell 7 and oil, even when fruits are 18, 19 millimeters, and get the proper thinning. You can also achieve some pretty decent results with just 7 and oil. 7 and oil is pretty common in Pennsylvania, but at this timing, once your kings are up in the 17 millimeters, or 18 millimeters, you just don't get much thinning by putting NA back in the mix. But maybe tomorrow we'll see you got all you need. Well, you won't be able to see it visibly yet, but we'll be able to pick it up with the fruit measurements.
How many, if I decide that I do need to come back in, how many ounce rate of the Maxell?
The 48 ounces per 100 on a delete tree row volume basis. So that might be as high, on some of your tall spindles, let's say they're 150 gallons. I don't know if you've measured them, but I'm guessing they're between 150 and 170 gallon trees. So the 48 would be the per 100, and you times it by 1.5. So what is that? 72 ounces to the acre.
Okay. And then still the pint of 7 and a pint of oil.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing that in regards to Honeycrisp, our Honeycrisp thinned very easily this year. We put the 10 parts on it, the petal fall spray, and for whatever reason, they really aggressively thinned this year. And have you been experiencing or hearing that in other locations?
Not really, but it depends a little bit on the kinds of carbohydrate deficits were associated with that. Did you happen to put that on? Did it coincide with the heat wave?
It did. Yeah, we were the day that we applied, or day after we applied it, when that was at 92 or 93 degree day.
Yeah, so the heat wave really impacted the Hudson Valley because it hit them at 12 millimeter stage. Western New York, it hit pretty much at the petal fall stage. And we got really nice thinning out of petal fall sprays. And it sounds like you got excellent thinning out of a petal fall spray when it's combined with big deficits in that heat wave.
Okay.
But I've been telling people, and I hope it's the case with you, it didn't overthin, did it?
I believe it did. Yeah, they're thin pretty heavy.
They're light, huh?
Very light.
So do you have a target number, and have you actually counted fruits?
I have not got out to count them yet.
Let's hope that it's a normal situation. They start showing up as you get into July.
One hope so.
You'll be close to the target.
What did you put on this?
But the Temp Parts is kind of an aggressive rate in the heat. I don't know if you ran the carb model then or what it told you, but I probably would have done with 7.5 parts during that heat at the pedal fall.
I did run a carbohydrate model, yes.
Mhm.
Terrence, a few others had mentioned, just the amount of natural thinning that, the Hudson Valley saw, and certainly that seemed to coincide, like you mentioned, at that 12 millimeter mark, where they just had those really extreme deficits, and it looks like it took quite a bit off. And, John Clements on the call also mentioned it sounds like they're seeing quite a bit of that in Massachusetts. Should we expect similarly in the Champlain Valley, or do you think that our carbohydrate situation is, a bit different from some of the other areas in the state this season?
I think it's different. First, let me comment that the Hudson Valley, the heat hit when fruits are most vulnerable, that 10 to 11, 12 millimeter. And I told them in the thinning calls we had with them that we were experiencing a natural induced thinning event, even with no chemicals. And I told them they should wait it out and not spray during that period. And they did mostly wait and spray after it. But what was hard to judge is how much natural thinning. And so there was really no fruit measurements going on there. So I chastised them, and several people started measuring. And the measurements that we ended up seeing was that the combination of natural thinning because of the heat at the right opportune time, and then a little bit of thinner later did a fantastic job and got people very close to their target number. But the Champlain was different. The heat was a slight tad less, and the stage of development was very different. At the petal fall stage, fruits are not nearly as vulnerable to heat and carbon deficits. This came out of the 18-year study that we did, where we looked at the slope of the effect of deficits. And at 12 millimeters, which is the most vulnerable stage, 10 gram more deficit every 10 grams knocks off X number of fruit. I don't remember it right now, but we have a relationship that says every 10 grams of more deficit knocks off more and more fruit. But at petal fall, that slope is very flat. You got to go like 50 grams more negative to get the same fruit knocked off that the same deficit will do at 12 millimeters. So I don't think you're going to see the heat-induced drop that the Hudson Valley saw. However, we got heat now, and it's not just only one heat wave. And so this heat, combined with the thinners that went on, I think are going to thin fabulously. Even if the thinners went on in cool conditions, the heat that's predicted up into the 80s a couple of days from now, I think will do a great job. But I don't think you're going to see overthinning, Mike.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions for Terrence?
Terrence, Will Gunnis again. Well, just one quick question. We've had two applications where we've put a pint of 7 on, but we have had virtually no rain on that 7.
Yeah.
How long will that 7 kind of stay viable on those leaves? Or any event that we do get some wetting, how long would that throw some thinning activity at us?
It'll throw a little bit, but not very much, for this reason. The 1 pint you put on in 2 different applications, 90% of that 1 pint was taken into solution and then was absorbed by the plant. And so the residue laying on the leaf from a single pint application is small. In fact, Peter Jensen and I, over the years, have talked a lot about this, that the 1 pint gives you a limited insect control because there's very little residue left on the leaf, because 90% of that pint is in solution and is absorbed. The second pint you put on was separate application, the same thing. So you don't have a huge residue laying on the leaf of 7, even though you've put a total of 2 pints on. That make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
But anybody that puts on 2 pints at one time basically pastes on like peanut butter the second pint, and it's just sitting there waiting. And it degrades over time, but it'll last more than a week, and you get rain anytime after that application that it re-wets and gets more thinning.
All right, great. Are there any final questions for Terrence before we sign off for the day?
Hey, this is Jesse again. I just had one quick question slash comment. Not, I just wanted to bring it up, and other people are probably aware of it. But I've noticed in the 2019 carbohydrate thinning model, when sometimes in retrospect of the recommendations for a given day, like for example, yesterday the model was saying increase rate by 30%. Today you look at the model and highlighted under yesterday's recommendation, it says apply standard rate of thinner. Now I'm sure the model just updates it day to day, and you're paying attention to what it is on the given day. But just a comment that maybe as an additional column or something like that would be just helpful to see what the recommendation was on given days in the past, because I'm 99.9% sure it's changing, and I'm going crazy.
No, you're exactly right, Jesse, and that's maybe a good idea. So the model uses actual historical data for every day up through yesterday. So the actual temperatures is what goes into the model. But for today, we don't know what the temperatures are, so it uses a forecast, and tomorrow it uses a forecast. And so the forecast today, tomorrow, and up 7 days forward changes. And when the day actually happens, and we don't get exactly that, it's darker or it's warmer or cooler, the model then uses the real data to calculate it, and then we'll end up with a different result. If we had perfect forecasts, they would always match, but the forecasts are not perfect. So it's the best we could do, but we could try to print, well, I'm trying to think how that would work, because every day, that day's forecast plus 7 days forward gives a certain number of recommendations. So it would be, I don't know, I have to give that some thought, but that's the reason it changes, Jesse.
Great. Well, thanks for your time today. Appreciate it.
Okay.
All right. If there's another lingering question, we'll wait another minute. But otherwise, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank Terrence for joining us for these 3 weeks. I'd like to thank Owesco for sponsoring these series again. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Terrence, bye.
Is that you, John Clements?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, good afternoon. How are things?
I was telling Mike and your folks that stuff's really thinning down here.
Is that good?
I think if we, yeah, it'll probably be all right. I think if we put 2 chemical thinners on, we actually put 3 with that heat wave.
I agree with you, John. That heat wave was just like another big shot of thinner.
Yeah. I mean, it just is a little scary right now, but usually what ends up happening, there's more apples than we think.
I hope that's the case, that it turns out just perfect for people.
A lot of fruits and clusters, the whole just stopped growing, period. All right. We'll see you later. Thanks.
Okay,
All right.
John. Good day.
Have a good one, everyone. Thank you.